Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton senior Tiger Gao. My guest today is Tim Roughgarden. He is a professor of computer science at Columbia University. His research interests include the many connections between computer science and economics, as well as the design, analysis, applications, and limitations of algorithms. We'll also talk about his most recent research in the cryptocurrency space, EIP-1559, and the future of Ethereum. And now I'm going to read out a very long list of awards that Professor Roughgarden has won, because he is a very renowned scholar in his field, as many of our listeners might not know. So Professor Roughgarden has been awarded the ACM Grace Murray Hopper Award, the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the Kalai Prize in Computer Science and Game Theory, the Social Choice and Welfare Prize, the Mathematical Programming Society's Tucker Prize, and the Gödel Prize in Theoretical Computer Science. He was an invited speaker at the 2006 International Congress of Mathematicians, the Shapley Lecturer at the 2008 World Congress of Game Theory Society, and a Guggenheim Fellow in 2017. He has written or edited 10 books and monographs, and is regarded by many, as many of my friends, my fellow college students would say, he is the GOAT, the greatest of all time in algorithm game theory teaching. We reached out to him very much because we interviewed professors Matt Weinberg and Alex Tabarrok earlier a few months ago, about issues related to cryptocurrency. And we asked them who we should talk to next, and who in the field is actually doing great research and providing signal and not noises. And everybody was talking about Professor Roughgarden. So it's truly a great honor to finally have him on the show. So Professor Roughgarden, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Tiger. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the kind introduction.
So I'm co-hosting this show with my friend Seyang Raghavan, who also just graduated Princeton in my year. We were both seniors. He was a senior in the math department. He has done research in the theoretical computer science and machine learning. And Seyang is very humble, but I do want to say this, that he also was a gold medalist of the International Mathematical Olympiad. So someone with significant intellectual capability and magnitudes higher than me. So Seyang, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Tiger. Very excited to be here.
So Professor Roughgarden, maybe we should start with your last name even, because that really fascinated me, Roughgarden, because it's literally spelled Roughgarden. So maybe we can start with the origin of your name and your history, your research, and what got you into computer science.
Sure. The name is Dutch. And actually, I dug up what the Dutch version was, and I'm not going to quite remember it. Maybe I'll send that to you later. But basically, kind of, I've heard different stories, but either 4 or 6, brothers who were pretty down and out in the Netherlands came over to the States, and I don't know when, 1800s or something. And so that's where that part of my lineage comes from, which maybe explains partly like my height, around 6'4", 6'5". So maybe I owe that to the Dutch side. I'm not sure. And then, so I'm a professor at Columbia, and I'm a computer scientist in the computer science department here. One of my core areas of expertise is algorithms. So, when I teach sort of core undergrad classes, it's usually classes in algorithms. I also have a couple of online classes in algorithms. But then, especially on the research side, for most of my career, my calling card has kind of been the connections between computer science and economics, really ideas flowing in both directions. So, how can you use tools from economics and game theory to make progress on important computer science applications, but then also kind of, looking for opportunities to put the computer science lens on the game theory and economics, and ask, what tools do we have that can give new insights into basic economic applications. Great.
So Tiger mentioned your incredible set of prizes. So I thought we could start with, in particular, the Gödel Prize, which you won in 2012 for your work on selfish routing, which has been celebrated as helping lay down the foundations of algorithmic game theory. So maybe to walk our listeners through this, could you first start by giving us an overview of the concept of price and anarchy?
Sure. And then just maybe some of the context. Right. So I was lucky to sort of get in on the ground floor of the whole sort of algorithmic game theory movement. It really started, so I started my PhD at Cornell in 1998. I didn't go there to do algorithmic game theory because algorithmic game theory did not exist at that point. I really went to do kind of algorithms, combinatorial optimization. And Cornell had a lot of strength in that, including my PhD advisor, Eva Tardosh. And then kind of, one of the trends that you started seeing in computer science, really in my first year of grad school, was because, so this would be 1998, 1999, and that was kind of the era, both of you are sort of too young to have seen this, but I mean, that was when the internet was in the process of becoming widely adopted. So it was definitely nowhere near as ubiquitous part of our existence as it is today. But to everybody, and especially to computer science academics, it was obvious that computer science as a field would have to respond, would have to change because of all of the new challenges posed by sort of the rise of the internet, so much computing moving to it. So early in my grad school, it was clear that was in the air, I would say. And in 1999, there were two really crucial papers, which are I believe the other two papers on the same Gödel Prize citation. So there was a paper by Nissan and Ronen, which was really shining the computer science, sort of looking at mechanism design from a computer science angle, in particular with an emphasis on computational efficiency. And then there was a paper by Koutsoupis and Papadimitriou, which introduced the concept of the price of anarchy. So if you study, really in sort of the very first lecture or on the very first page of any game theory book, what you learn is that, typically when individuals do what's in their own interest without regard to the collective, the results can be very bad for the collective. And so one famous example would be the prisoner's dilemma. I won't sort of tell the full story, but basically, both would be better off if they cooperated, but they each have a unilateral incentive to not cooperate. Another example would be the tragedy of the commons, where it's better for everybody if a resource doesn't get used too highly, but everyone has an individual incentive to sort of overconsume, right? So you can think about like pollution, right? Everybody's better off if we don't pollute that much, but any given sort of entity, gets, because there's an externality, because basically, the individual makes a decision. There are sort of modest consequences for itself, but there are also modest consequences for tons of other people. So on balance, it's bad for society, but an individual thinking only of themselves and not thinking of the externality is going to, do the wrong thing from a societal perspective. So this is something just, you study any economics or game theory at all, and this is true. That sort of, Nash equilibria can fail to be Pareto optimal, would be some of the jargon for it you learn in like a game theory class. And, so then usually the next step where you would go in econ or game theory would you basically say, how can we change the game or change people's incentives or change the payoffs so that we get an outcome that we're happier with, right? So for example, if you're talking about pollution, maybe you have some kind of tax, right? So maybe you force people to sort of internalize the externality, the damage they're causing to others by making them pay for it themselves. And then you can, there are ways to align kind of how individuals behave with what you'd like to see for the collective. So that was sort of the historical response you'd see in economics and game theory about like, what do you do if, the incentives are bad and people are incentivized to behave in a way that's not good for everybody. And so the Price of Anarchy paper that Koutsoupis and Papadimitriou wrote in 1999, that really took a completely different tack at addressing the question. So they basically asked the question, all right, so we know that, lots and lots of different games, Nash equilibria or selfish behavior will lead to suboptimal outcomes, but like, how bad is it really? Like, because it's a big difference whether it's like, okay, it's like almost as good, it's just like a little bit different, it's worse, but not much worse, versus it's a total disaster, right? Those are like sort of two very different situations. Like the first one maybe doesn't call out for regulation at all, right? If selfish behavior leads to something that's, in some sense almost as good as what you'd achieve with full coordination, maybe you can live with it, right? Whereas obviously if it's going to lead to kind of, if the problem is going to lead to the, decay of society or something, you might want to be more aggressive about it. So that's where the Price of Anarchy came from. So my second year of grad school, this was, I guess, probably October 99. Ava and I were at Berkeley. We were visiting for a year. She was on sabbatical there with her husband, David Schmoys. And we went to sort of the theory lunch that they have every week at Berkeley. And I was a starving grad student. I was not going to not go to a talk that had free food with it, which this one certainly did. And then it just so happened that this theory lunch that I showed up to on that fateful day, Leonard Shulman, who these days is a professor at Caltech, he explained on the whiteboard something. He read it in sort of American Scientist or a popular science magazine like that. He just read it like earlier that day. And it was like, here's this cool thing I saw called Brace's paradox. And so Brace's paradox is this, which was sort of first written about by Dietrich Brace back in 1968, And so he observed that, if you look at a network, right, and the network can mean many things, but think of it just like cars on the road, just like a simple traffic network that like we're all familiar with. It can actually be the case that you can build a new route, right? So you can seemingly increase the capacity of the network. But even with the amount of traffic staying exactly the same, people will actually choose different routes, and the result will be worse for everybody, in the sense that everyone will experience more congestion, and everyone will have higher delays going from from their origin to their destination, right? So somehow, you give people more options, and it exacerbates kind of the suboptimality, kind of selfish decisions. So that was Brace's paradox, and Leonard had this like very nice 4-vertex 5-edge example you sort of put on the board, where this is sort of kind of basically you have 2 parallel routes, and he showed that if you sort of put in a teleportation device to go straight from one to the other, everybody wants to use the teleportation device, but then everybody's doing the same thing, so they're all congesting each other, so they all take like much longer than they did before, when they were naturally separating into sort of 2 groups and having only half the congestion. So it's this super clean example. And so Leonard asked an open question, which I did solve, but that was in my 3rd paper. It took me a while. He asked about whether or not there's an efficient algorithm for detecting whether a network suffers from this paradox or not. But Christos Papadimitriou, I mean, he was a professor at UC Berkeley at that time. He was in the audience. He'd just written that paper with Koutsoupis. And so he just said, he's like, you could also ask, how much worse could the equilibria be than an optimal solution? Optimal solution meaning, imagine an altruistic dictator just sort of decided the routes that everybody would pick, going from their origin to the destination, to minimize their average commute time, their average sort of travel time. So Christos said you could ask how much worse is the equilibrium compared to that. And that really caught, I mean, I thought it was cool too. I mean, one of the things I really loved as a student was network flow. It's like max flow, min cut, these kinds of things you learn in an algorithms class. I loved that stuff. Max flow min cut theorem is probably one of the reasons why I became a theoretical computer scientist, to be honest, that and the halting problem maybe. So I was very taken with what Leonard was talking about, but then Ava, my advisor, she was very taken with it. And I was at the beginning of my 2nd year. I knew very little, but like one really smart observation I had, which is, if you want to maximize the engagement of your PhD advisor, work on the problem about which they are the most excited. And I had sort of figured that out at that point in my graduate education. I was like, Ava's excited about this. I'm going to drop everything and I'm going to collaborate with her. We're going to try to crack this thing. And we did, actually. So that, which wound up being the How Bad is Selfish Routing paper. So there's sort of 2 theorems in that paper. One we proved kind of late 99, one we proved early 2000. It was published in late 2000. And so the first theorem that we showed was that in the types of networks that Leonard was talking about, where delay increases as an affine, say linear function of the road congestion, we show that actually, if you let drivers pick whatever routes they want and settle into an equilibrium, the average delay is never going to be more than 33% than it would have been had an altruistic dictator just picked optimal routes for everybody. An extremely simple example is there's both the Brace paradox example that Leonard showed. There's an even simpler one with just 2 parallel routes, known as Pigu's example. Those already show that 33%, you might get stuck with 33%. Like that was the easy part. Like it could be as bad as 33%. But Ava and I showed that it can't be any worse than that. No matter how big and crazy your network is, no matter how many different origins and destinations crisscrossing each other, sort of doesn't matter. 33% is sort of the magic number of how much you might conceivably lose due to selfish routing. And I think that struck everybody, computer scientists, but really even more so, I think, in my experience, it struck economists as a shockingly low number, right? Because again, you train in economics, you just drilled into it that, you have uninternalized externalities lead to loss of efficiency, lead to Pareto suboptimality. That's just, that's part of, it's built into you. And then to have this example where, it doesn't falsify any of those points, right? I mean, it is still suboptimal, where it's just like not that big a difference. So in my experience, that really, really was a very pleasant surprise to a lot of economists. And I think that's one of the reasons why some of the work I've done has been easier or harder to get acceptance from the economics research community. That one was very easy. And I think one of the reasons why it was very easy is because it had a punchline that was both surprising and optimistic, which I think really, really struck people.
So Professor Roughgarden, just to kind of recap this brilliant story that you told, and also told in such a smooth way. You're a very good storyteller, but I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. So people are selfish, and sometimes we're understood traditionally that if you're selfish, you impose a bad externality on the system, overall societal welfare decreases. But there are cases where even if you increase the pie, the number of rows or the number of resources available, and it doesn't actually solve the problem, it could actually make the situation worse when people are selfish. And on the contrary, counter to a lot of our imagination, in certain cases, you could even close down the road and reduce the pie. And in some sense, take advantage of the fact that people are selfish, and that would actually lead to a better outcome, collective well-being. So that seems to be the interesting dilemma and problem, counterintuitive problem that computer scientists and economists are working on.
That's a great way of distilling Brace's paradox into a nutshell. And I would say it's funny. I'd say people who've seriously studied game theory, in some sense, find it very unsurprising. They still usually like the example, but they find it unsurprising because really, more generally, what it's showing is that sometimes you can take away options from people and actually wind up with a better overall result. Because basically, you take away people's temptations to do the things that seem good for themselves but are bad for everybody else. And so, game theory, you do see a lot of examples of that form. Those people not trained in game theory, I think, find it, delightful. I mean, it's a great thing to just show someone on like a cocktail napkin, at a party or whatever. So it's an enduringly cool example. I never get tired of Brace's paradox.
Yeah, that's a great story. So in terms of, so then kind of to fast forward to some of your later work on Price of Anarchy, you were kind of interested in thinking about kind of more general notions of equilibrium than the Nash equilibrium, right? So could you walk us a bit through kind of why that's a consideration that is worth making, and then kind of what your findings were on that front as well?
Sure. Great question. So, really ever since, Nash, ever since really the definition of the Nash equilibrium, it's been an essentially, maybe non-constructive is not quite the right word, but certainly Nash phrased his theorem as an existential result, and he used mathematical techniques. Oh, right. So what am I talking about? So Nash, John Nash, same person in Beautiful Mind, if you've seen that movie, defined the Nash equilibrium, absolutely crucial figure in game theory. So he proved a very fundamental theorem. Nash has a bunch of theorems. This would be Nash's sort of famous theorem in game theory, which was that any game, right? So it could have any finite number of players. Each player could have any finite number of options, and there can be arbitrary player payoffs for every possible outcome of the game. So sort of really like completely general model, modulo finiteness. He showed there exists a Nash equilibrium. What's a Nash equilibrium? Well, it's basically like a stable point. Okay, so it basically means everybody's behaving in a way which for them is optimal given what everybody else is doing. Okay, so if nobody else moves, I don't want to move either. Okay, so I'm doing what's called the best response. I'm doing the best thing for myself given what everyone else is doing. If that's true simultaneously for everybody and nobody wants to move, that's what's called the Nash equilibrium. And Nash proved that at least one Nash equilibrium always exists in any game. And this is really kind of the bedrock of game theory, because it means you can literally write down any game at all, anything you can think of. And when you talk about the Nash equilibrium, you're talking about something well-defined, right? Like you can speak about equilibrium outcomes of the game. There might be more than one, so you might have to worry about kind of which equilibrium do you want to talk about, but it's hard to overstate kind of how solid a foundation that puts everything on, to just know that you always know what you're talking about in any game whatsoever. Now, Nash proved his theorem using a fixed point theorem. Actually, he gave a couple proofs, one with a more sophisticated fixed point theorem, Kakutangi's fixed point theorem, but there's also a simpler proof he gave using Brouwer's fixed point theorem. And we now understand that it's in some sense even basically equivalent to Brouwer's fixed point theorem. So it's really a sort of a Nash's theorem is sort of a fundamentally fixed point, type result. And what's curious about these fixed point results is they really, they're very indirect, put it that way, right? So Nash's argument does not go, okay, take an unhappy person, make them happy, take another unhappy person, make them happy, and then at some point you're done and everybody's happy. That is not how the proof goes. Okay, the proof is very indirect. So you don't really, from his proof, from this guarantee of existence of equilibria, the proof really gives no insights about any plausible behavioral process by which players would actually reach an equilibrium. That's the sense in which I mean it's sort of a non-constructive or existential result. Like, you know, the stable point is out there, but if you're at an unstable point, there's no guarantee that it'll just sort of naturally wiggle its way and get to the stable point. Now, in some types of games, that's going to be true. Like the traffic routing games I was speaking about, actually, you do have very nice sort of constructive properties of equilibria. But at the level of generality, of abstraction that Nash was talking about, there was really no hint at how you would ever reach it. And as the years went on, you know, mathematicians and game theorists, you know, started to understand that it seemed like a fairly ill-behaved mathematical object, Nash equilibria. It's always there, you know, but for example, if you make small perturbations to a game, the set of Nash equilibria can change dramatically, right? As opposed to just moving a little bit, they can actually completely change. And you know, another example would be the set of Nash equilibria do not constitute a convex set. Convex set is something that's totally filled in, where it contains all of its line segments. So in general, Nash equilibria are just sort of a bunch of kind of isolated points. Okay, and so there was this, you know, I think if you asked, you know, any kind of economist or game theorist, you know, how nice of an objects do you think Nash equilibria are in general? Or if you ask them, you know, do you think there'd be a sort of simple algorithm for computing one in general? I think most economists and game theorists would have said, probably not. It seems like kind of a messy concept. And then what was cool is like, this was a great opportunity for theoretical computer science, and in particular, algorithmic game theory, to bring kind of its unique skill set to this issue, right? Because really the, you know, right at like the, you know, what's more in the wheelhouse of theoretical computer science than proving in a rigorous way that things are sort of non-constructive, or that things cannot be found by an efficient algorithm, right? So like if you've ever studied sort of NP-hard problems and that kind of stuff, you know, heard of the P not equal to NP conjecture, all of that is work in theoretical computer science, which is ruling out fast algorithms for certain problems, like say the traveling salesman problem. And so, you know, really one of the key pillars, really, I mean, there's brilliant work that was done, not by me, entirely by other people, in algorithmic game theory, which, you know, made precise the sense in which there's, in general, there is no efficient algorithm for computing a Nash equilibrium. Really, it sort of avoids, you know, it's just, you know, Nash's argument is sort of complicated, and it's a provable sense in which it has to be complicated. You will not be able to just take a sort of short sequence of steps and guarantee yourself that you'll be at one of these equilibria. And so, right, so that was work that came out kind of in the middle of the aughts, so like ballpark 2005 or so, by, let's see, you know, Kostas Daskalakis, Paul Goldberg, Christos Papdimitriou, Shi Chen, Ziding Den, and Shenghua Tang. They were some of the key figures in that work in the mid-aughts. And so that was brilliant stuff. But then, you know, tying this back to what we were talking about before, these price of anarchy bounds, right now it sort of seems like, it almost seems like, you know, the snake is eating itself a little bit, right? Because on the one hand, you had algorithmic game theorists proving that, oh, in all these kinds of games, Nash equilibria are guaranteed to be almost as good as the best thing you could hope for. And then in a different part of algorithmic game theory, you've got Theorem saying, oh, but players can't find a Nash equilibria. So yes, you know, so you would conclude that, okay, I guess an equilibrium would be near optimal if you could get one, but then, you know, these other algorithmic game theorists are telling me I shouldn't expect players to actually reach one. So for a brief period of time, for a couple of years there was sort of this quandary. Again, so for the traffic routing networks I was talking about, there it is relatively easy to find an equilibrium. So those theorems were not in so much danger, right? I mean, it's sort of clear how to interpret them. But for a different game, you know, if you prove that, you know, equilibria are close to optimal, but you can't prove that players are likely to find it, it's not really clear how to interpret the guarantee, interpret the equilibrium guarantee. So that led me to probably my kind of, you know, second to most recent kind of significant work on the price of anarchy, which developed sort of a toolbox for extending these equilibrium guarantees, which we sort of knew and loved for Nash equilibria, and extending them to more permissive notions of equilibria. So if you only know one notion of equilibrium, like Nash equilibrium is like the one you should learn. But if you sort of dig a little deeper into game theory, you find out that there's actually several other equilibrium notions as well. In fact, there's sort of a hierarchy of equilibrium notions. And what's nice is some of these more permissive equilibria, meaning, right, so like So like you might have a game where the Nash equilibria are just kind of these three isolated points. And then if you go to one of these sort of more permissive equilibrium concepts, it might be like a nice convex set that includes in particular those three isolated points. So it has the Nash equilibria plus a bunch of other stuff, and it's mathematically much better behaved. So when I say more permissive equilibrium concept, that's kind of the mental model you should have in mind. All right, it sort of captures all of the Nash equilibria plus other stuff, and moreover, it's sort of a really nice set, right? So just think of it as like a polygon in higher dimensions. So the good news about these more permissive equilibria is they are easy to learn in a sense. So if all players use pretty lightweight kind of learning algorithms, where they kind of say, okay, let's see how my different strategies have done in the past, and let me sort of move, let me sort of, you know, maybe I don't take the one that's done the best in the past, but at least I take sort of a randomized decision where I favor strategies that have done well in the past. So just sort of simple things like that, where players experiment over time and gravitate towards strategies with good historical performance. If all players just sort of learn in that sort of simplistic way, you actually can prove that players will reach one of these sort of bigger, more permissive equilibrium sets. They may not reach those three isolated Nash equilibria, but they will wind up somewhere in this sort of bigger region. And so those are very important results from game theory. You know, Foster and Vara and Hart and Mas-Kalel would be some of the key names there. That was sort of late 90s or around the turn of this century. Okay, so point being is Nash equilibria may be hard for players to figure out how to get there. Game theorists had figured out these sort of more relaxed notions where at least we knew that players could figure out how to get there. Right, but so now one still has to connect that back to the price of anarchy guarantees, because price of anarchy. You know, what is the price of anarchy strict? You know, what's its formal definition? If you have a game and you have an objective function, you know, like you have a traffic network and you care about average delay, right? It's the ratio of two things. You know, on the bottom is the best possible objective function value you could attain. Okay, what an altruistic dictator could achieve by controlling everybody's actions, and then the numerator is how well you do it in equilibrium. Okay, and so when I said the 33%, you know, figure for selfish routing, that's because it's, you know, the price of anarchy is 4/3. Again, that's as high as it ever gets. Now, games, as I sort of mentioned, can have multiple equilibria. So then you have to ask the questions like, okay, well, in this ratio, the denominator is well defined. That's just like the best you could do. The numerator is supposed to be in equilibrium, but there might be many equilibria, some of which are better than others. So what do you do? And in the formal definition of the price of anarchy, you look at the worst case equilibrium. So you set it up so that any kind of bound on the price of anarchy is as kind of strong as you could hope for. So if you say the price of anarchy is 4/3, what you're really saying is, I don't care what equilibrium people find. As long as they find some equilibrium, they're going to be within 33% of optimal. Okay, so that's why it's very satisfying if you can prove a guarantee that holds simultaneously for all equilibria. Okay, so that's what the price of anarchy is. But now let's go back to this mental model we had of, like, we had our three Nash equilibria that were isolated, and then this big set that's containing them, right? So the price of anarchy was only saying all three of those isolated points are good, right? All we were proving all these years was that, you know, the Nash equilibria were near optimal. What about all this other stuff, right? So it's fine to sort of move to this more relaxed equilibrium concept, which becomes computationally tractable. But now you might think, okay, probably some of these outcomes are going to be a disaster, like the three Nash equilibria, maybe they're good, but now I picked up all this other extraneous stuff. Some of those might not be so good. And so this work I did in 2009, which sort of introduced a theory of smooth games or smoothness arguments. Basically, the takeaway from that paper, what was it called? It's called the Intrinsic Robustness of the Price of Anarchy. That's the name of the paper. And it basically showed that, you know, the bounds we've been proving all along for Nash equilibria were in fact far more general than we realized. And so in our minds, we only had these three dots in mind when we proved like our factors of 4/3. But actually, if you go back and look at the way we were proving them, the sort of characteristics of the proofs we were using so that the 4/3 would hold for this whole big set as well. And so now really the two worlds are kind of reconciled, right? So this really says, on the one hand, yes, it's true, Nash equilibria might be hard to find. On the other hand, these price of anarchy bounds we've been showing are actually much more robust than we realized. They hold not just for the computationally intractable Nash equilibrium concept, but they hold much more generally, even so generally that they hold for these easily learned equilibrium concepts.
That's fascinating. So just to kind of try and recap that, and feel free to jump in and correct any of this, but basically the price of anarchy notion is for a Nash equilibrium that may or may not be difficult for participants to realistically reach. But we have these more relaxed notions of equilibria that we can reasonably expect the participants in this system to reach. And so it's valuable for us to extend these price of anarchy bounds to those more relaxed equilibria, because then that gives us some realistic guarantee of like, okay, in an actual real world setting, if people are to act selfishly, then it still won't be that much worse than if there was a benevolent dictator telling everyone what to do.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And I should say, I mean, there's definitely there was several results, really nice results by others leading up to the 2009 paper I mentioned, Christodoulou and Koutsoupis, and then one by Blum, Hadjigai, Leggett, and Roth. And so my contribution there was really kind of showing there's really a pretty general theory explaining what's going on. But by that point, there were already, the researchers I just mentioned had shown that at least in a bunch of different cases, this seemed to be happening. And then my paper gave sort of the general explanation of why.
So Professor Roughgarden, I guess we're kind of going chronologically. You were mentioning how when you were a first year, second year graduate student, you went to those conferences and saw those problems and began to tackle them. So that was the line of work regarding algorithm game theory, and we were talking about these different equilibria. I guess maybe another line of research that you were doing would be auctions. What are some of the questions there? And I guess maybe both of them kind of in some way eventually converge into the current, more recent work, the new work you're doing right now on crypto. So maybe before we go into crypto, we can also quickly talk about your work in auctions.
Sure. Right. So I'd say, right. So I already, so let me use the phrase mechanism design. Auctions are kind of a key application within mechanism design. Mechanism design, it's often described as inverse game theory. So, in game theory, like a game falls from the sky, and it's your job to sort of figure out the equilibria or figure out various properties of the game. Whereas in mechanism design, in some ways, it's very, computer scientists really relate to it because it does have a very engineering feel to it. There, it's more like you start with the outcome you want to have happen. And then you ask, how can I set up the rules of a game so that my desired outcome naturally arises as an equilibrium? So how do I sort of, set things up so that players naturally kind of lead to the best possible outcome? And auctions are kind of the special case where you're trying to get an efficient allocation of scarce resources, basically. Okay, so I already mentioned mechanism design because I mentioned Nissan and Ronin back in '99. That was a super key paper at the very beginning of algorithmic game theory. There's another paper more sort of on the AI side that also was very important and had similar points by Lehman, O'Callaghan, and Shoah. So those were the two late '90s papers that really kind of kicked off the ball for what was called algorithmic mechanism design, meaning mechanism design where you also care about things running in polynomial time. So mechanism design was a part of algorithmic game theory from the very beginning. For example, when I was a grad student, an academic twin of mine, meaning someone my same year who also had Eva Tardosh as his advisor, a guy named Aaron Archer, he was working on mechanism design with Eva, and they wrote some nice papers on the topic, including one from 2001, introducing so-called sort of single parameter algorithmic mechanism design. So I mean, I was in the thick of it. I got to tell you, like that whole time I was in grad school, I didn't understand it at all. I really didn't understand mechanism design. It took me a long time before I sort of got it at all.
It's like me right now in this interview. I really don't understand anything. I mean, it's just
yeah. So yeah, but so anyway, so I got to Stanford as an assistant professor, and at that time, 2003, 2004, I kind of felt like my ideas in the price of anarchy area were kind of the marginal value I thought was decreasing of the ideas I was having. Which has been a recurring thing, I'd say, in my career. I work on something, I feel like I have some, insights that are sort of helpful that other people don't seem to have, at least not yet. And then at some point, I kind of feel like, the ideas I'm having are also being had by 100 other people. So maybe I should move on. So 2003, I did still write kind of two more, price of anarchy papers that I'm particularly proud of after that, but still, for the most part, I was kind of out of ideas in 2000 and 2004, or high impact ideas, I would say. So, but I was clearly an algorithmic game theorist. I started teaching it at Stanford in 2004. And certainly, there was no way I wasn't going to teach the students mechanism design. So I had to teach myself to teach the students, if nothing else. I have to say that first time I taught it in fall 2004, even then I didn't understand it at all. So I don't think I did that great a job teaching it. But at least I started trying. I started, 2004, 2005, I started putting in the investment, which kind of, it's what I have to do. I mean, I have to put in a lot of time, feel stupid, not get it, be patient, don't get frustrated. And then at some point, things start to click. And then all these things which sort of seemed unrelated and confusing, like all of a sudden you start seeing sort of the big picture and how they interlock. And that's the point at which you can start doing kind of meaningful research. So I was putting in that time in 2004, 2005. I first started sort of publishing in mechanism design, 2005, 2006, a sequence of papers on cost sharing mechanisms with my first ever PhD student, Mukund Sundarajan. That was a lot of fun, but it naturally led me to something which wound up being a very fertile thing to work in, which is basically revenue maximizing auctions. So, one use of auctions is the allocation of scarce resources. Obviously, another application would be, someone owns a bunch of stuff and they want to sell it and they want to make as much revenue as possible selling their stuff. And so that's revenue maximizing auctions. And there's a famous paper from economics by Roger Myerson. It's really one of the most beautiful papers I've ever read in any field, called Optimal Auction Theory. Appeared in 1981, Mathematics of Operations Research. And he basically completely solves the revenue maximization problem for single parameter problems. It's not important that we say what that is, but the simplest case would be just like you're selling one item and you want to do as well as you can. And the question is, how should you do it? So for example, should you set a reserve price, right? If you're selling, so like for example, even just say it's like Christie's and they're selling a painting or something. Should they set a reserve price? If so, what should it be? Should it be high? Should it be low? Given the information that Christie's has about the likely willingness to pay of bidders, how does that inform how they should set that opening bid? So that would be like a very simple version of the optimal auction problem. More generally, Myerson considered, like, suppose you do super crazy things that look nothing like the kind of stuff you see at Christie's. Suppose you just have a crazy procedure. Could you do even better? And Myerson showed the answer is actually no. Myerson showed that at least in sort of the symmetric case where bidders are IID, actually you may as well just use the auctions that you see at Christie's with a suitably chosen reserve price. And his theory even tells you exactly how you should set that reserve price, how you should set that opening bid. So I believe it was 2006, 2007, somewhere around there. Jason Hartline gave me a copy of that paper. Was like, and he just said, I want to think about this. And so I spent some time reading it, and that was one of those moments where things sort of clicked. In part because Myerson just lays it out so beautifully in that paper. It's the kind of thing that if you're primed appropriately, you can just kind of upload it directly into your brain. That's kind of how clear it is. And so it was great. It was great just to understand it. It was such a beautiful piece of work. But then, like so many other things, when a computer scientist actually finally properly internalizes something in economics and game theory, they naturally have instincts and ask questions that an economist or game theorist would not. Or if an economist or game theorist would ask it, maybe it would occur to them, but they would say, I don't think I'm going to work on that because I'm not sure I could publish it in like a big econ journal. Right. Whereas, computer science, if you're a computer scientist, that's not as much of an impediment. So that it was very much true there that, as soon as I understood it, it was just, there were lots of interesting directions that immediately revealed themselves. So, yeah, I want to keep things short. So let me just, I'm trying to think. So there's really three different threads of research that literally came out of just really understanding Roger Myerson's paper, all of which, so it's only, let me try to give a short summary. So economists, including in Myerson's paper, they do what a computer scientist would call average case analysis. So they would say, okay, let's do, Christie's would do some research, try to figure out like what people are likely to sort of be willing to bid, and then assume some distribution. Like let's assume it's, uniform distribution between 1 million and 2 million, something like that. And then, Myerson would say, okay, you tell me your distributions, you tell me sort of the, how how willingness to pay is randomly distributed, and I will hand you back, the optimal thing to do. By optimal, I mean maximizes your average revenue on average over the distributions you assumed. And computer scientists have historically been fairly hostile, I would say, to average case analysis, because in a lot of application domains, the feeling is you don't have a very good feel for what is the distribution that governs, say, the inputs of the problem you're trying to solve. Like if you're trying to solve a traveling salesman problem, do you really want to assume that like points are, IID on the square or something? Probably not. That's probably not what real instances look like. So there's a very kind of worst case bias in computer science where you seek out, and we saw this already with the price of anarchy, right? So the worst case, because that's so ingrained in all computer scientists, that was sort of the obvious first definition Koutsoupis and Papamitru came up with. Oh, there's many equilibria. Which one should we look at? Oh, we're gonna look at the worst case equilibria. And that's in fact the title of their paper. The title of their paper is Worst Case Equilibria. So it's completely embedded in computer science culture to make minimal assumptions and to strive for guarantees that hold kind of no matter what the input looks like. And so the short version is, Meyerson's was average case. There was a theory of worst case revenue maximization in algorithmic game theory at that time, pioneered by Goldberg and Hartline and Carlin and others. But there was also, there were other theories of worst case revenue maximization waiting to be, invented and written about. And that's what I spent a lot of sort of the late aughts on. So 2008, 9, 10, 11. I was very focused on that, and like I said, that turned out to be a very fertile vein to mine.
Yeah. So just to tie together our threads on both Price of Anarchy and auctions. So both of your stories in your research in these fields kind of seems to be a very nice story of how you started with kind of relatively simple foundational question in the field, and then kind of found ways to add like specific layers of complexity to the question in a way that was interesting and added complexity that people, both like economists and people in the real world would find interesting. But at the same time, you were also able to provide like theoretical insights along the whole way. So when you're coming up these questions, how do you decide which extensions kind of tick all of these boxes? Interesting, relevant, and I guess amenable to theoretical analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, some of the boxes, you don't know if they're going to be ticked till after you spend a lot of time on it, to be honest. One piece of advice I always give to graduate students, is, whatever you're working on, at least make sure that like the best case scenario of how the research might unfold is like super, super interesting, right? Like if even the best case scenario is only mildly interesting, I would recommend working on something else. Now, to be honest, like the best case scenario, sometimes it's like literally just a false statement. Sometimes maybe it's true, but it's like just beyond one's abilities to prove, at least in the short term. So often one settles for something which is less than the best case scenario. But so that's the first thing. As I do think it's worth. So for example, like one criterion I use is kind of like, I think. I want to sort of, have a problem or a conjecture or something where I can say, oh man, if only I could solve this, I immediately see how to give like a really engaging hour-long seminar about it, right? So for me, I mean, this somehow like research and communicating research for me are very, very deeply intertwined to the point that they're almost sort of the same thing. And so it's almost like when I evaluate what research I'm working on, a key tenet is to what extent I think I will be able to excite and or help other people with the results. So that's kind of high level. And a variant of that advice I often give is, when I should say, okay, so in the kind of theoretical research that I do, there's kind of a couple different phases, right? The last phase, which is what, beginning students are by far the most comfortable with, is you've identified not just the mathematical model that you're working with, but you've also identified the mathematical statement that you are hoping is true, that you want to either prove or falsify. And then, then it's like basically a homework problem in a class, right? You can just think of it as a problem set. You can imagine your instructor wrote down the statement and said, prove or find a counterexample. And now you just sort of go and solve the homework problem, hopefully, right? And so what's somehow very hidden, usually when you're taking just sort of courses, is how much hard work goes in before you get to that point. Okay, so and indeed I'm happiest when I'm working on something where I feel like no one has articulated the right theorem statement yet. like forget about the proof, right? Just like what is it we should even be trying to prove, right? So, and like, we talked about the, the paper about, price of anarchy guarantees for sort of relaxed notions of equilibria. That's probably one of my favorite examples from my own papers, where, that paper introduced a definition, of sort of a particular type of proof, and then there was this sort of theorem, which kind of said, any proof of this form will lead you to sort of robust bounds. And just, it's not, I don't, who knows, maybe there were other people just, one day away from writing down that theorem themselves, I'm not sure, but I've never seen direct evidence that anyone had thought of articulating that particular theorem statement before. And indeed, like a lot of my favorite theorems, once you actually figure out the statement, the proof kind of writes itself, once you kind of figure out just sort of the right statement to make. So let's see. So your question was about how do I write? So I'd say, so right, good. So another rule of thumb I tell graduate students is just kind of, when you're trying to figure out what the right theorem statement should be, right? That's how this connects, right? So the first thing I said was just like, how do you even choose like the question? Like, how do you even choose like the direction you're going in? And then there's a question of like, if you don't know if you know the model, but you don't know the theorem statement yet, like what theorem statement should you pursue? And my recommendation is always kind of like, write down the coolest statement that could be true, right? So the most general, most interesting thing that you haven't yet falsified. Now, probably the next step that you do is to falsify it. And so then you refine what's the coolest thing that might be true, because now you've sort of known more. But the point is, it's kind of like, I mean, I guess I'm being a little too sweeping because I do like to go both directions. But I think, often we're taught, start with true, simple things and then try to push them to be kind of more and more general, more and more complicated things that are true. And I guess one way of saying this, like, what's the coolest thing that could be true? That's kind of working in the other direction, where you start with statements that are so powerful and sweeping they're false. And then you sort of keep refining them, and then until you get to one that's actually true. So it's almost kind of like a false to true level of working as opposed to the true to false, which I think most of us find maybe a little more natural, or maybe we're just trained that way more. But this false to true version, I think doesn't always work. But there are cases where you wind up basically short-circuiting all these sort of messy intermediate results you would have otherwise proved along the way, and you wind up actually sort of seeing the big picture earlier than one might have otherwise. So that's another kind of mantra I like. Try to prove the coolest thing that you don't yet know is false. And then there's sort of the level of like, okay, once you know the theorem statement, once you know what you think is true, how likely is the proof to be interesting or interesting to mathematicians? And that, I think if you work every day in mathematical research, you do develop a pretty good instinct, pretty good guess. But it's hard. I don't know that that's hard to give advice about other than just, keep at it, right? And talk to more seasoned people. Like if you're a student, talk to your advisor, talk to more senior grad students. Like say, oh, I think this is true. And then Ava was like amazing at this, right? You'd say a statement that you had some like 2-page proof for, and she'd look at it, and 2 seconds later she'd say, oh, but that's just like complementary slackness of this like primal dual linear programming pair. And you've got to be demoralized because you'd spent like 80 hours on this proof, and she saw it in like 2 seconds. But the point is, like, that's what trains you to know. You're like, okay, this kind of statement, if this statement is true, it's probably true for like quite straightforward reasons, as opposed to, something where you're like, as opposed to something like maybe there's something where you kind of have something seems to be true, but it seems to be true for very different reasons and different concrete examples you've looked at. Then you're thinking like, oh, wow, if I could unify these, probably this is going to be interesting, because it somehow has to specialize separately to these 2 different things, which looks very different from each other. That would be like a sign that the proof probably is going to be interesting and difficult. But again, it's really, that comes with practice primarily, I would say.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for those insights, Professor Roughgarden. I'll definitely be coming back to revisit these 3 to 4 minutes over the coming years. And yeah, some of those insights, especially the false to true, and then the thing about research being entangled with how you communicate research. Yeah, it's just incredible. I look forward to revisiting this.
Absolutely. This is like a treasure trove for any, I would say, aspiring students like us who are trying to become better researchers, better thinkers. But Professor Roughgarden, I guess I'm from the econ finance side, and when I talk to people who are doing investing, and they often say you want to develop reps. When you have seen hundreds of companies, you can kind of all of them kind of propose this grand vision of what's the coolest thing that they can achieve, and then some of them you can tell these are the concrete steps you can take and make that thing happen, and some of them you can tell they're frauds, and I guess that's also kind of a way similar to your way from a research perspective from you, which is like, what is the coolest thing that could happen for this proof? And once you become a better researcher, you have a better intuition regarding what would need to happen to piece things together. So maybe I guess this is also a good segue towards the cryptocurrency space. So what would be the coolest and most powerful statement you could write about a cryptocurrency or decentralized finance or Ethereum? And to what extent have you reduced that statement, refined that statement to its current stage now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should say I like your point that in evaluating companies, you could sort of take some of that. You could take that same approach. Like, if I wanted to be as generous as possible to this team, like what vision would it have happen? And then also think about like, how would you falsify it? Like, why try to poke holes in that own thesis? So,
and if it's too easy to falsify them, or then it probably isn't true, or something
yeah,
like
and I'd say higher level, what both speak to is think both sides of the issue, right? And it's like, I think a lot of us are told this frequently, but there are just a lot of forces in the world that push us away from it. So one has to keep reminding oneself, if you believe something, take half an hour and pretend like you're just become a different person. Like just pretend like actually, you want to do nothing more than kind of like, playing devil's advocate, but like take it very seriously, basically. And so it's certainly true in theoretical research. And one piece of advice actually is that I do give to students is, if you're going to work on a problem, choose a problem where you have the skill set to prove it, no matter which side is, whether it's true or false, basically, right? And so, because it's very dangerous, if you try to prove something because you're sure it's true, and you never think about why it might be false, or if you don't have the skill set to actually prove that it's false, if it is false, that's very dangerous. That's how you can waste a lot of time. So so my grad students, I'm often just saying like, here's a statement, either it's true or false. We should be able to figure out which one it is. Hopefully it's going to be interesting either way. Let's just go do it, right? So that's kind of like the perfect problem to give to a grad student. And then, same thing on like a sort of investment thesis. It's like, spend a half an hour, just believing it and coming up with the strongest argument that you could. Then spend a half an hour just trying to destroy it, basically. And it's really important to go back and forth. It's just so easy to, have self-reinforcing beliefs, right? If you don't really actively try to poke holes in sort of your own thesis. Okay, so sorry.
No, this is great. All this is great life's philosophy. So yeah.
So I think the right analogy here, so saying like, how would you formalize, cryptocurrency / blockchain? I mean, the right analogy is not something like what we've been talking about, something relatively narrow, like revenue maximizing auctions or pricing anarchy guarantees. I mean, the analogy, it's a little bit like saying like, have you boiled down the internet to sort of a very kind of crisp theorem and definition, right? And the answer is no, nobody has. And the reason I like the internet as an analogy for several reasons. I mean, obviously, most cryptocurrencies build on top of the internet, but let's just. I mean, I really do. It would be. I didn't start doing computer science research till like sort of the mid-90s or something, and sort of the web had just sort of barely came out. So, we did. I was aware of the internet since the time I was studying computer science, but still, take 1988 or something, like when which I believe was the year TCP/IP congestion control or TCP congestion control was invented or was published or something like that, right? So that I was 13, so I certainly wasn't aware of it or thinking about it. But I wonder if working in cryptocurrency blockchain now is what it felt like working on the internet in 1988 or maybe even 1984 or something like that. Again, I was too young then to know what it felt like, but I really do wonder. And so one of the things I like about the analogies is there's just many layers, right? And so when you talk about blockchain technology, just like when you talk about the internet, there's many different layers of the stack you can focus on and that are super important and where there are really interesting research directions between. So for example, at the very least, on the blockchain side, there's, right, so you hear about layer one, for example, Layer one, right? So like Bitcoin is a layer one, Ethereum is a layer one. What does that mean? That means it's a consensus protocol. So it's a sort of distributed algorithm. So, lots of different computers, hopefully scattered all over the world, hopefully thousands of computers, are all running sort of the same software. They send messages to each other over the internet, and then they run this consensus protocol, which keeps them all synchronized so that everybody has the same shared state. So for example, just in Bitcoin, if you're just watching sort of Bitcoins be transferred back and forth between different accounts, you want everybody to agree on which transactions have actually been valid, you want everybody to agree on what everybody's account balances is. So a consensus protocol is a distributed algorithm which achieves that functionality, that keeps all of these different nodes synchronized. And again, Bitcoin is a novel consensus protocol. Ethereum is a novel consensus protocol. There were consensus protocols, much earlier. A couple Turing Awards have been given out for consensus protocols. But the big sea change with Bitcoin is it's a so-called permissionless network. So historically, consensus protocols, right? So like the historical application would be something like, you're working for IBM. IBM has a database. They want the database to have basically, 100% uptime. So I guess you need to replicate the database. So maybe you make like 2 copies, 3 copies, 4 copies of the database. Then it's like, in case one of them goes down, so you can still service queries. But then you're like, but when we have multiple copies of the database, we need to make sure all the copies of the database are the same. We need to keep them synchronized. So just forget about the internet. We'll just have our own little private network by which the different copies of the database can talk to each other and stay in sync. Okay. And then so these early computer science pioneers, people like Barbara Liskov and Leslie Lamport, developed protocols by which you could do this, and in particular they characterized, right? So they proved really interesting theorems of the form like how many so suppose you want your database to stay up as long as at most one machine fails in a given day, right? How many copies of the database do I need, right? And then they'd say, the answer is 4, no more, no less, something like this, right? And so, but the point is like, that's very different than when we think about like Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? I mean, that was like IBM built, bought 4 copies of database, connected it with their own network. There's no concern about like who anybody is. Like we know who the 4 databases are. They're all talking to each other. There's no adversaries. Maybe something goes down, but other than that, there's nothing to worry about. Whereas Bitcoin is a consensus protocol where literally anybody can just show up and join, right? So like, the other people running the Bitcoin protocol, you don't know them from a dog. They could be anybody, right? Many of them could be controlled by the same party. You have no idea, right? So that's the big, that's so 21st century consensus protocols. Well, no, but so specifically sort of, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and blockchains of that ilk. The big novelty is their permissionless nature. The fact that the set of participants is not fixed and known a priori. Okay, so that's layer one. So layer one is kind of like, let's just keep all these machines that don't know anything about each other. Let's just keep them in sync. Okay. And there's great research opportunities there. So that's I'd say that's where that's where the most academic work has happened. I think in part because it's sort of relatively well defined, and in part because the earliest blockchain technologies, Bitcoin, et cetera, are layer ones, and because it connects rather strongly to an existing academic discipline, namely the theory of distributed computing, right? So like these results by Lamport and Liskov and Lynch and so on that I mentioned. So for all those reasons, there's a big literature on layer one blockchain protocols. I still think there's a ton to be done. I have been doing work on layer one and even on consensus protocols, specifically with Andy Lewis Pye at London School of Economics. But still, that's relatively well developed. A lot to do still, but relatively well developed. Now there's a layer zero. Layer zero would be basically the peer-to-peer network on which the consensus protocol operates. So that's starting to get sort of more distant from my expertise, but it's clearly super interesting. Literally just earlier today, I was watching a talk that was all about, how do you do things at layer zero so that layer one works as effectively as possible. Then there's layer two. Layer two is so-called scaling solutions. So Bitcoin and Ethereum, they only they only process so many transactions. So Bitcoin, I think the best case scenario is something like 7 transactions per second. Ethereum, the best case scenario is maybe twice that, but really several orders of magnitude less than where you'd like to be. You'd like to be certainly thousands of transactions per second, if not more than that. So layer two, those are all proposals for how to basically, it's kind of like you're going to have like a sort of tree of blockchains. You're gonna have a hierarchical structure where your layer one is kind of like the root, which is kind of like the ground truth, and then you're going to have these sort of subsidiary blockchains, which sort of basically for example, take a bunch of the computation off the plate of layer one and move it off chain. Anyway, so there's layer one, which is the basic consensus protocol. There's layer two, which is basically trying to have a 100x increase, I would say, at least, in the transaction processing. And layer two, there's really cool stuff. So there's really interesting game theory questions. There's really interesting cryptography questions. So like for Ethereum, one of the main scaling solutions are these things called rollups, where again, the point is on layer one, you keep a record of what transactions have been carried out, but the computation is all done off chain. But you need to somehow sort of prove that the off-chain computation is valid. So there's optimistic rollups, which rely on game theory. There's ZK rollups, which rely on zero knowledge proofs. So again, you're not supposed to, this is not supposed to make sense in real time. I'm just trying to paint the picture of how big what's going on is, right? And how, okay. And then on top of layer two, you have the application layer. So like DeFi, for example, decentralized finance, that would all be still on top of that, right? So if you're writing kind of a DeFi app, you basically just want to trust that the consensus protocol and sort of the scaled extension of layer two, you just want to trust that they can handle whatever you throw at them, right? You're really just trying to sort of take input from users and basically kind of send messages to sort of your contracts that are on sort of the main chain. Just like in the internet stack, right? I mean, if you're designing a website, you're not thinking about TCP, you're not thinking about congestion control, you're not thinking about routing, you're not thinking about the IP protocol, you're not thinking about how the network's wired together, et cetera. So same thing in the blockchain world. There's this application layer where ideally you would know nothing about what's going on underneath. Now, realistically today, to do a really good job sort of writing kind of smart contracts and developing applications, you do actually need, it's good if you do know a fair amount about what happens beneath you, but hopefully those abstractions will become cleaner as time goes on. So point being is, I really feel like there's enough going on here to occupy almost any type of computer scientist I can think of, right? So theoreticians, hardware people, networking people, HCI people, at the application level. In my view, really what's happening is, I don't know if I want to call it a new area of computer science or a new discipline, but it's certainly kind of a new, unique synthesis of stuff across the computer science spectrum, which is just extremely fascinating. So I've been sort of drinking from the fire hose for the last couple of years. I'm trying to teach myself all kinds of things I never had time to learn before, including sort of stuff like traditional finance and relevant programming languages stuff, et cetera. But ultimately, I'm just trying to, right, which goes back, we talked earlier, I talked about how mechanism design, there's just this when I pick up a new field, there's just this long period of sort of deep confusion. And I just have to sort of get comfortable with it and almost lean into the confusion, I would say. And so I'm very much in that stage in the blockchain world. I think a lot of people are. So I'm really just looking for opportunities of little pieces I can sort of bite off and make a contribution. And so, right, so like some layer one stuff I did, with Andy Lewis Pi, we had a couple specific theorems which basically kind of explain the dichotomy you see between different types of layer one protocols. So-called liveness favoring protocols, like Nakamoto consensus longest chain versus safety favoring protocols like BFT protocols. So we proved a theorem, which is sort of fundamentally there is a fork in the road. You have to choose one or the other. But that was a bite-sized piece which sort of connected to what's happening in the layer one world. I did some work on Ethereum's on this proposal called EIP-1559, which is going to be this big change to the way transactions are priced on the Ethereum network. That again, it was kind of right in my wheelhouse. It's really sort of a mechanism design question fundamentally, but it's an interesting mechanism design question because there's stuff you can do kind of in traditional mechanism design applications which you can't do in the blockchain. So blockchain, just by nature of its sort of permissionless setting, for example, the fact that you have to rely on sort of miners, self-interested miners to sort of execute your mechanism, that imposes a lot of challenges. That means you have to rethink the mechanism design problem. So that was another example of, hopefully, it's an important problem in the sense that, it helps So hopefully that work helps the Ethereum community kind of better understand the game theoretic properties of this new transaction fee mechanism. But it's really, it's again, it's nibbling off a relatively bite-sized piece. I mean, it is like 58 pages, so it's not that small, but it's still like, it's something I could get my head around and work on and produce something, in a time frame of months. And so I'm very much in this stage. On the one hand, I'm spending some of my time trying to piece together a global view of everything that's happening, or at least the closest approximation that I can, while at the same time looking for sort of these specific, opportunities where I can actually contribute meaningful research. So sort of both of those are happening for me at the same time right now, in parallel.
Professor Roughgarden, that is so much to unpack. The reason we kind of mentioned at the beginning of the interview, the reason why Seong and I are reached out to you is because we interviewed Professor Matt Weinberg, who is a mechanism designer, a computer scientist at Princeton, and his work had a lot of intersection with cryptocurrency. I interviewed Alex Tabrick, who is an economist at George Mason University, and he's also one of the mainstream economists who is learning more about from the economics perspective, what to do with a lot of the crypto projects, and he's sort of acting as an economist, chief economist role to a lot of those projects. So, and when we talk to them, they say so much noise in this space. If you're an average person, someone who's curious, you go on CNBC, they're all talking about decentralized finance. They're all talking about Bitcoin. Everybody's trying to give price predictions, 40K, 60K, investment banks are writing reports about this, but it seems that nobody actually understands what is going on. And a lot of mainstream academics certainly are very skeptical of this whole, crypto people. I mean, economists are saying you guys use so much energy, like you guys are probably not going to live up to the promise, blah, blah, blah. So I guess from our perspective, maybe even going to the beginning, what made you want to come to this crypto space at the beginning? Because you did say it almost felt like, working at the beginning of the internet. And also, what are some of the major obstacles that you would currently identify that you think would be nice for people to because if you talk to CNBC people, they'll say that, all kinds of new problems, and it seems that there are a million projects people are working on. But what do you think are the actual core problems that people should understand?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's several things going on here. I mean, one is, right, I mean, so there's this kind of, I don't know if it's a joke, I mean, it's not really a serious question, but like in the blockchain world, people ask, are you in it for the money or for the tech, right? It's something you sort of hear a lot. And, that's a telling statement because, I mean, what's really, as far as I know, kind of unprecedented is how intertwined the technology and the investing is with cryptocurrencies and blockchain. I mean, clearly, like one of the big innovations here is, incentivizing things through tokens, which are not, in a way that has not historically been done with, say, typical companies, right? So, like for example, and you can argue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but suppose imagine I had heard about Coinbase really early on, and I thought it was awesome, right? And I somehow wanted to, one, support them beyond just being a user of Coinbase, two, invest in them. Right. So for some random person like me, like it's not obvious how I would have done that. Like I couldn't have just, there wasn't going to be an open call for a seed funding round or something like that for a traditional company like say Coinbase. Now once it IPOs, many years later, yes, at that point, I can go to TD Ameritrade or whatever and sort of buy some stock. Whereas somehow, I mean, what's crazy is basically, a lot of these, crypto companies, you can basically be an investor from day one, right? So it's kind of like all of a sudden everybody can participate in the seed round if they want. A lot of those participants are themselves kind of heavy users of those protocols as well. And so that's just, I mean, so I think that's part, there's a lot of things going on about why there's so little sort of signal to noise. But one thing that's funny is it's kind of like, even if you care primarily about the tech, right, you still actually have to understand, I think, a fair amount about really the tokenomics of these protocols are part of the tech, right? So it's kind of like, if you have a great consensus protocol, but you don't have a pathway by which people are incentivized to adopt it and build on it and so on, it's not going to succeed, right? Maybe you can write a research paper about it, but you're not going to be a serious competitor to Ethereum, say, without really understanding kind of the incentive pathway for adoption. And things like token price then really sort of actually matter. So that's
the tokenomics part.
Exactly,
how do you incentivize, how to price things? I see.
Exactly. I mean, and even like say Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? I mean, sort of the equilibrium, like the security of those blockchains, does, sort of depend on, the current price of Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? I mean, if Bitcoin drops by a factor 2, at equilibrium, you definitely expect the hash rate to go down significantly. And then you're more susceptible to a 51% attack. You have less hash power. I mean, so this again, I mean, this is what's like, I mean, probably there's some precedent, but I can't think of one, where somehow like you basically can't assess the technology and sort of, how good or bad it is without actually, understanding price dynamics, the incentives of the token and actually, caring about the market price a little bit. So that's one of the things that's going on. It's like even people who normally would just say like, whatever, I'm in it for the tech, like you still have to actually care about all this other stuff, right?
And
obviously,
I guess
go ahead.
Just to quickly interject, a lot of these governance tokens, say if you buy Ethereum, if you own enough of those governance tokens, you have voting rights on it, right? So you can vote, you can decide the fate of the project. So it's certainly political theorists would also come in and talk about things, but that is also why tokenomics matter, because that is the decentralized mechanism through which decisions are made, is through those tokens.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, there's different flavors of tokens. That's certainly an important one. And often the token has multiple roles. So for example, if you look like Uniswap or something as an example, Uni tokens, they're currently governance tokens, but it's possible that at some point in the future, there'll be a governance proposal to actually have dividends go to Uni holders as well. And so that could have that sort of second role. We'll see, but I mean that's something that could happen. So that's one reason for all the confusion. Another reason is just new technology is often, I think, covered very poorly in the mainstream media. Like if you go back to, again, you guys are too young for this, but like if you went back to articles about the internet in like 1995 or something, you've got people like Paul Krugman on record saying that basically the internet would be as influential as a fax machine. Nobel Prize winning economist who has done a lot of great things, but had a very wrong prediction about the internet, right? So I think so that's also part of what's going on. It's just sort of new, and again, like this is something where really most of the people in this space don't understand it very well. I certainly don't feel like I understand it very well, and so it's to the point that even the technologists, like, and part of the problem is it's hard to even communicate it until you understand it very clearly in your own mind. I mean, to me, that's always been like the two-step approach to like teaching. Like number one, teach myself and understand it. And then number two, figure out the clearest way to convey that understanding to others, right? And I'm very much still in step one in this space. And I think most people are very much just in step one. So I'd say it's and then of course there's like, obviously the volatility gets people's attention. It makes for great news headlines. Then you've got the whole thing with kind of the environmental aspects of like proof of work blockchains like Bitcoin, Ethereum 1.0. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that
to understand.
I mean, part of what's fun about the whole thing, it is very exciting, I have to say. I mean, even though, even all the weird stuff, I don't know. It's fun to work on something that's both this sort of, really new area of computer science, like rising up like a wave under us at the same time, while also somehow being of some interest to almost everybody, it seems. I mean, it's kind of amazing they're having at the same time, right? So
maybe we should jump into EIP-1559, because that is one main project you worked on. EIP stands for Ethereum Improvement Proposal, and that is this update that is it's scheduled to go live this July 2021. And it would change the fee structure for Ethereum, and it's like a very major update that everybody's been talking about. So how did you come across this idea? Maybe give us the layman's kind of explanation on this thing.
Sure. So this was something. This had been talked about for quite a while. I think I was approached to do work on it in maybe, I'm guessing something like June 2020. So I was approached by a member of the Ethereum community. I had heard of it already at that point, but I wasn't actively thinking about it. But then someone reached out and said, would you be willing to do this as a formal project? And like I said, it felt like a perfect storm. It was really kind of, right in my wheelhouse as a mechanism designer, but also with enough differences that it was scientifically, I thought, extremely interesting. Plus, I mean, there was what's amazing, and this is partly your answer of like, why did I get into blockchains in the first place? I mean, it's very unusual to have such a strong external demand, like hunger even, for formal analysis, right? So 2017, I started getting cold calls from startups saying like, we really need a computer scientist who understands mechanism design. And I was like, and obviously like, the big data companies, like there was that demand before, but it was like a new thing. It's like, there's a totally new source of demand for my skill set. Where was I going with this?
Someone gave you a call. Satoshi Nakamoto, the guy that nobody knows about, gave you a call and said, Tim, please come work for us.
Yeah. So, I remember now. So right. So as a person, so for the EIP-1559 thing, like one thing that was attractive was just, it was this perfect mix of stuff I understood and stuff I didn't understand, but like was going to be tractable to understand. So it was a great project handed to me on a silver platter, basically. I'm sort of very grateful for that. But there was also, I mean, the other thing that made it very easy to accept, right, to agree to it, is there was a palpable hunger from the Ethereum community for a more academic analysis of EIP-1559. And so Tim Biko, who's sort of a key figure in the Ethereum community, he even did a community outreach survey. So he reached out to lots of Ethereum stakeholders. He reached out to miners. He reached out to people who write, wallets. He reached out to exchanges. And he said, like, how does everyone feel it? This was in October, I think, 2020. So 9 months ago. And so 1559, there were definitely people who wanted it, but there were other people who were nervous. And so he said, one of the things he said is like, how can we make you feel more comfortable with us making this really big change to the transaction fee mechanism? And people mentioned a couple things, but one of the top things they mentioned was that they wanted to see a formal specification and analysis of the transaction fee mechanism. And they were one of the reasons they were nervous is they had not seen that. And Vitalik Buterin sort of wrote about all the ideas for sort of several years, and in some sense, you could say that a formal specification is kind of there in what he wrote, but it wasn't, it still wasn't at the level of kind of mathematical precision, that's in my report. I'm sure he could have done that if he wanted, but I sort of made it totally precise mathematically, and then I was the first one who really formally interrogated its game theoretic properties. And so the point is, like, I mean, it's just to be able to do a research paper where that like the day you publish it, probably more than like 1,000 people will look at it. I mean, that's actually very unusual for sort of an academic, especially sort of a theoretical leaning academic such as myself. So just like I said, a perfect storm, a really good match for my skill set. And it just really felt like it would be helpful to a relatively large community of people. So, it's really up to them to say whether it has, but I hope that it has. So,
with all of the insight we're hearing from you, I'm almost inclined to think that Tiger and I might be speaking with Satoshi Nakamoto right now.
Don't think so. Yeah.
The real Satoshi would never say yes, but yeah, all good.
So I forgot to answer what your question. What is 1559? Well, basically, it's you can think of it as basically moving to congestion pricing. If I had to summarize it in one sentence, that's sort of how I'd summarize it. So basically, right now, people just have to sort of make up their own prices that they are willing to pay for their transactions to be executed, and then they leave it to miners to sort of just pick the highest bidders. So in effect, you're bidding in basically a first price auction. You're trying to bid higher than all of the other people trying to get their transactions into the blockchain, and that's a tricky problem to figure out exactly how to bid. And so now there's really going to be more like a price that the protocol computes internally. So the protocol itself will be monitoring whether it seems like the current price should go up or down depending on signals of demand in the most recent blocks. So you can think of it as like sort of a congestion pricing constantly adjusting at a pretty short time scale.
So what would be the most basic intuitive way to understand why people are constantly talking about mining or fees or the gas? That's kind of the term for Ethereum. I mean, why do we care so much about fees? Because I suppose the fees are the way we price the incentives, we price the scarce resources, and not everybody can use Ethereum, so we have to allocate the resources. Is that the reason? I mean, everybody's talking about fees.
Right. Yeah, it's fundamentally sort of supply and demand. So if not many people wanted to use Ethereum, you could just set the fee to be 0, and that would be fine, basically. But the problem is, like, if the fee was actually 0, there's a zillion, people would spam the network, people would start storing their, files on Ethereum or who knows what, right? If it was, I mean, there in some sense, like, if the fee is 0, people will fill up the blockchain with just not very valuable stuff, right? So you really can't get away from fees if you want to have an economically efficient allocation of your scarce resource, which is real estate on the blockchain, right? So on the one hand, you don't have room for everybody. And then on the other hand, like, of the people you want to include versus exclude, you like the higher value transactions to be included and the lower value transactions to be excluded, right? So how do you know what's the value of a transaction, right? You can't just know if you're the protocol. You can't just ask people, because they might sort of tell you that, oh, this is value $1 billion to me, right? They just make up a number if they didn't have to pay it. So how do you actually sort of figure out, how do you screen, how do you figure out who's the high value transactions, who's the low value transactions? You charge a price, right? The low value transactions are not going to be willing to pay the price. The high value transactions will be. So that's what the transaction fees are meant to do. Just sort of perfectly split it so that, you fill up the blocks 100%, and they're filled up with sort of exactly the highest value transactions, where the value is at least the price. Anyone whose value is below the price, sorry, demand was too high, you got excluded. And so basically, in the current setting, basically it's up to the users themselves to figure out what this magical price is. And then in the new version, the protocol will actually take on that burden itself. And the protocol will internally figure out what the right price is supposed to be.
So the direction that Ethereum or decentralized finance, I mean, we were kind of drawing this picture of layer 2, layer 3, people are continuing to build on it. What do you think is the general direction it's headed towards? Because, I mean, we're kind of having a conversation that is more related to computer science, but if you talk to economists or regulators, let's talk about, policymakers or the average mom and pop in the Midwest, when they want to interact with the crypto community, what are the obstacles? I mean, it sounds like right now the fee structure, for one, is very unclear. It's hard for the regulators even to figure out how much people are actually paying when they're giving the money to this protocol. Is there an intermediary? Who am I giving my money to? So I guess from your vantage point, is Ethereum, after this update, headed towards a place that is more transparent, that's clear fee structure, and that is more towards the vision that can be regulated under some more mainstream framework that people can conceptualize?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I see any direct interaction between the switch of transaction fee mechanism and regulatory aspects. And in general, I would say that, yeah. So I'm not sure that, I doubt that'll make that big a difference. I think on the regulatory side, I mean, I sometimes think this issue is painted as much too binary, like either it's regulated or it's not. And I definitely think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think a lot of people in the crypto space would be happy to have regulation as long as it was consonant with innovation. And again, this is and so I think there has to be a decision made by the U.S. government and other governments. What kind of approach are they going to take, right? And again, I think the internet is an interesting analogy, right? Because in the 90s, the U.S. government had to decide, again, the question wasn't like whether or not to regulate at all. The question was like, what's going to be the shape of the regulations? And I'm far from an expert on this, but my understanding is that, under the Clinton administration, there was a pretty, they established, their approach to regulating, commercialization of the internet was fairly friendly to innovation. And my at least I've heard many people speak about that as a big success. Like part of the reason the U.S. is sort of so dominant in tech is because of the forward-thinking approach that was taken back in the 90s. And so I think and I think is this going to be as big as the internet? I don't know, but this is big. I mean, I think this is going to be one of the. I think the 2020s, this will be a big part of the tech conversation, at least for this entire decade. And I think it's a big enough new paradigm that, again, I mean, I think kind of, there just seems. I mean, I think there's really like a policy decision that needs to be made. Like, are we going to be scared of this and try to really kind of limit how much how much innovation can happen in the US in this space, or are we going to try to really actually become sort of global leaders, in this technology? Because you got to believe that some parts of the world are going to be perfectly happy to just try to lead in the space, and the US has to sort of decide if it wants to be one of those or not.
Professor Roughgarden, I guess the better way for me to have phrased my question would be, how did you feel like EIP-1559 was fitting into the broader kind of timeline or spectrum of innovations of Ethereum? Is this leading up to a series set of updates or innovations that will continue to shape Ethereum towards a certain form? And we were talking about at the beginning of this section, what's the best case scenario, kind of grandest statement we can write? Is that statement in you guys' eyes kind of like, average Midwest mom and pop, everybody is using smart contracts, you open your phone and it's running on some app on the blockchain, layer 3, layer 4, whatever. And to get there, we would need to solve a series of problems, one of which at this current stage is 1559, and then we do the next one and the next one. So just to plot that kind of vision out for us.
Right,
maybe.
right. Yeah, I would say I think 1559 is good for Ethereum. There's several benefits, but the two people focus on, one is, as we were saying, it's just much simpler, right? I don't have to figure out the price myself, right? The protocol just tells me the price. So that's sort of much easier for apps building on top of it. It should be better for the user experience ultimately, and that was the original goal. It also arguably improves Ethereum's tokenomics. It's sort of there's natural inflation in Ethereum because miners are paid with newly minted ethers. But 1559 includes a burning mechanism, which actually imposes a sort of countervailing deflationary pressure, which many people believe will be sort of good overall for the currency. As far as I don't know that I view 1559 as absolutely necessary for achieving the big grand vision that I think you did a nice job of spelling out. Where, and again, I keep going back to the internet as an example, but the point is right now, like you say, you open your smartphone, you bring up the Twitter app or whatever, you're not thinking about how your phone is connecting to the nearest base station. You're not thinking about how the base station is sort of getting, sending data to and getting data from, Twitter servers or whatever. That's all just totally hidden. And things are not, definitely, you can't, even just, I don't know. Even just something like sort of figuring out MetaMask and worrying about, keys and stuff. There's a bunch of stuff in the blockchain world, which is just really too, it's not, it needs to become trivial to sort of perform functions, I would say, for mass adoption. Like you say, I do think that's just kind of a sequence of problems that has to happen, right? And again, the internet existed way before the web. It's important to remember, right? So in the 80s, who was using the internet? It was really just big tech geeks, right? Using bulletin boards and some early email adopters and that kind of thing. And it was harder to use, right? You really had to know more about how the system worked in order to use its functionality, right? But then, as things got more and more abstracted away, all of a sudden, it lowers the barrier to anyone else using it. So, I'm sort of expecting to see some kind of roughly similar trajectory in crypto. I do think, 2025, it's not clear to me. I'm not sure that feels a little soon to me to really be easy for everybody to use. 2030, I think maybe I think best case scenario is 2030. Yeah, people are opening their phone, and they're basically just kind of using the blockchain for payments and God knows what else. So
yeah. So Professor Roughgarden.
And one thing to be said, I guess, is like in 1988, right, when people were just trying to get the internet to kind of function relatively decently, avoiding congestion collapse through the TCP protocol and just these very kind of technical innovations. In 1988, no one would have been able to predict, say, Uber, right? Which obviously does require the internet, right, to be the killer app that it does, right? And so, it's just it feels so that would have been so 88 was maybe 20 years before Uber or something. So if you fast forward 20 years from now, so right now, what are we doing? Like people are basically trying to get everything to like just kind of work, more or less. And so that at least kind of very savvy people can like have non-trivial functionality, right? So like if we fast forward 20 years from now, like what's gonna be the analog of Uber in 2040? I mean, that's like an unanswerable question, I think. But I think if you just look at patterns, I think there's reason to believe there will be some analog, that there will be, that people your age in 2040 will not be able to imagine a world where you didn't have, crypto being part of sort of day-to-day, the fabric of day-to-day life.
So Professor Roughgarden, just to put a kind of mechanism design spin on all of our discussion so far on crypto, what would you say, maybe, would you be able to provide like kind of a short list of like 4 to 5 key kind of mechanism design or incentive considerations that you think are kind of really underpinning what crypto is struggling with right now?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer on the spot. Yeah, I'd say, there's a few things. I mean, one thing I get asked about a lot, and I don't have very good answers for, is different approaches to tokenomics. So basically, protocols want to incentivize adoption. As we discussed briefly, there's different types of tokens. There's sort of a big design space there of how to structure the incentives around the token of a protocol. And it'd be very nice to have some sort of simple taxonomy. Like here's one approach that's been successful. Here's another approach. Here's another approach. Here are the trade-offs between them. And it'd be nice if there was, ultimately it'd be nice if there's some cookie cutter approach where, a startup 5 or 10 years from now, just like, oh, our token model is sort of the standard one, which has worked in all these previous cases. So that, that really is an incentive / game theory problem, right? So just guidance for sort of new protocols about how to set up rules around, the token usage and sort of what to expect. That's a really big one. Let's see.
I guess Sam and I were just trying to get a sense of what are some of the big questions on your mind left unaddressed, or just in general, what do you think the crypto space, whether in Ethereum or Bitcoin or other projects, have to address if they were to, the key bottlenecks?
Yeah. So good. So I'll take, those are sort of 2 separate questions. So as for other stuff, so that's an important question. I think another important, so one of the killer apps so far of DeFi has been DEXs, decentralized exchanges, Uniswap being a good example. But there's other examples like Balancer and Curve. And these so-called automated market makers, it feels like there should be a very nice theory. And actually there's a few researchers who have already been sort of spelling out that theory. There's a nice sequence of papers by Tarun Chaitra and Alex Evans, and I forget his last name, but and Garris, I think is his last name, who started this theory. But so again, for me, like I want to develop theory that gives guidance to designers, right? So I want to basically take something off the plate of someone who's sort of building a new exchange or building a new protocol, right? So because ideally, like for example, suppose today you wanted to write a compiler for a programming, you wanted to sort of invent a new programming language and write a compiler for it, right? That is actually a super hard problem, but actually there's like great textbooks that will tell you exactly how to do it, right? You might have some, idiosyncratic challenges for your specific project, but there's incredibly strong guidance about how to approach that very complex problem, right? And previous generations of computer scientists have done that. It's a major achievement, right? So the holy grail here would be you have a textbook which really kind of says these are kind of the main design decisions you need to make. These are the different reasonable options, and these are the trade-offs that you need to you need to evaluate when you're thinking about the different options for the design decision. So so I think the tokenomics example is solidly in that category. Like you'd like sort of what are the main options and what are the trade-offs when you're putting together an automated market maker, right? There's sort of Uniswap's XY equals K rule. Curve has its own rule. Both of these protocols keep iterating, coming out with new versions. Like, is there some optimal DEX in some sense, or is there some kind of natural way to sort of parameterize the design space so that you can talk about trade-offs between the different points? so that'd be another example. As far as impediments to the whole space, I mean, if you want to talk about like what really could hold it back for, I mean, a lot of stuff is like technical problems that'll presumably just eventually be solved, right? Like kind of, making zero knowledge proofs practical enough. Maybe that's already been solved. It certainly wasn't solved 10 years ago. Maybe now it's been solved. If not now, maybe a few more years, right? We will have sort of zero knowledge proofs kind of with the kind of parameters that we need to really be practical. So those, to me, I think there's super interesting research to be done, and I'm really excited to follow it. But I don't see that as like an existential threat to kind of crypto succeeding. I mean, I think that will happen, and there's a bunch of other technical issues that I also think will happen. So one place which again I think will happen, but I think is lagging and is really like lacking. I think not enough people are thinking about it, is just like we were talking about. How do you make things relatively trivial for people to participate, right? So like if someone doesn't want to kind of figure out MetaMask and worry about keys and worry about getting hacked and and just wants to kind of invest in some cryptocurrency or send money to a friend like they would over via Venmo or something, making that as absolutely trivial as possible. So just sort of like user interface type stuff, and again kind of the application layer, just having even maybe like a couple levels of abstraction to make it really simple to the end user. There, again, I think that's got to happen eventually. I wouldn't mind seeing progress on that a little faster than it is now. But anyways, the point is, like, if that doesn't happen, I do think crypto will stall, where it's really just kind of relatively dedicated people, which is still millions of people, but it's not billions of people. I think if billions of people, clearly, like, you really need to make it trivial to use. And so there, I think there's a lot of work to be done. And then the other thing, which again, we also touched on, was just sort of, regulatory aspects, I think is sort of an unknown. You can't like shut down Bitcoin, right? I mean, because anyone can sort of run the software anywhere in the world, so unless you kind of really controlled everybody's computers all over the world, you wouldn't be able to shut it down. But you could imagine, right? You could imagine, a really bad case would be, a country makes it illegal, to send a Bitcoin transaction, right, while you're on U.S. soil or whatever, something like this. I'm optimistic that won't happen, but if that did happen, that would obviously be problematic, right? So I think it is going to matter. So I do think, I think it's important that, anyways, I think that's a wild card. I think that's a big wild card. How much will this technology be embraced by various governments, and how much will innovation be really explicitly promoted and incentivized, as opposed to it just kind of happening on the fringes, like some open source project or something like that. So those are the two big things. Again, neither of which is something I can really work on directly. I work on the more technical aspects, but big picture, those are the things that I wonder about.
Professor Roughgarden, we have so many more questions, but I guess we'll have to let you go in like 5 minutes. So maybe two last quick questions. One from me would be, from my perspective, you very much at sort of the setting the foundation for a lot of the research on crypto, solving very core problems, and there are other people coming in, building on top of things, programmers. What are the people you interact with in this space? I mean, do you usually interact with other computer scientists who have PhDs, professors? Are you in talks with your other colleagues who are coming from traditional pedigrees and hesitant to enter the space? Do you talk with entrepreneurs? Do you talk to frauds? What is like the space like from your vantage point, just kind of on a social kind of interacting with people level?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's pretty messy. So I was watching crypto from a distance for several years before I started really working a lot on it. I'd say maybe 2016, 17, 18. Maybe I wrote a paper or two, but for the most part, I was just watching it as a hobbyist. And the reason was, I knew it would take a tremendous amount of effort to understand things to a degree that I could do research at the level that that could be the expectations for myself for my research. And so I had to be convinced that the payoff would be high. Like, I knew it was going to be literally years. And I got to tell you, like, right now, it basically feels like I'm taking a bachelor's degree in a program that doesn't exist yet, where I'm also kind of trying to figure out my curriculum while at the same time studying that curriculum. it feels to me like kind of a 4-year degree I'm in the middle of doing. And so obviously I needed to have some confidence that it would be worth it before I undertook that. And finally I did, like maybe 2019 or something. I was like, there's definitely enough here to keep me busy for a long time, and this is going to be worth it. And part of the reason why, I knew it would take so much time is because there's not some textbook you can just read. There's not some sort of online course you can just take and have a strong understanding of the space. I mean, there are books, there are some courses that do help, that will teach you some stuff. But I mean, it's very, very early days. So I do talk regularly to academics. I mean, I'm definitely at my core an academic for sure. What's interesting is on the academia side, how many, right? So I'm not talking to that many academics from my own fields of expertise about this. So meaning theoretical computer science and algorithmic game theory. There are actually not very many people. There's a few, but there's not very many people from those communities that are working hard on these issues. So it's much more kind of, I'd say the security side, the crypto side, distributed computing. Those are the computer science academics. So those are the ones I'm now starting to interact with much more than I have historically. And then of course, economists also. Again, I wouldn't say it's mainstream in economics, but several very good economists, including Alex, who you talked to.
The ones that don't feel pressure to publish in journals,
So like, I have to tell you, I would not have done this if I didn't have tenure. I mean, this is maybe even like the first time where I really felt like, all right, I actually like feel the power of tenure, because
risk on
I
something.
take this 4-year degree and then everything might just collapse, or everything might be made illegal and like it winds up not being worth it. But I can tolerate that risk, right? I'm not gonna lose my job if this whole crypto thing doesn't pan out. Right, but so I also am, I mean, I gotta tell you, I mean, I definitely, I do pay some amount of attention to crypto Twitter. That's where an enormous amount of kind of discussion is. I read way more blog posts than I used to, way more Medium posts, hang out on some Discord servers, Telegram, I still don't really have a lot of appetite for, but I mean, there's a lot of knowledge out there, but it's very diffuse. And honestly, I think, I'm definitely like, number one, I'm a researcher, but like I said, I mean, I do, number two, I'm an educator. And I do actually feel like in addition to hopefully doing some good research, I might actually be able to synthesize, and bring together in one place some of this kind of knowledge, which is currently very diffuse. And to be honest, I think the EIP-1559 report, I feel like was a bit like that. I mean, I think maybe not everything in those 58 pages was already known, but a lot of it was. But it was not known in a way that was easy for other people to access. It was kind of scattered over lots of random sources. So I think one contribution of that report is to bring everything together into one place. And so this fall, I'm going to teach a class called Foundations of Blockchains, which I'm hoping will also start playing that role a little bit. So really, sort of documenting the synthesis I've been able to come up with for myself, and hopefully, sharing that with other people, so they don't have to sort of, sift through Twitter as long as I did to kind of get the juicy nuggets of information. So I pay attention to kind of, discussions in the community. I do talk to entrepreneurs. I'm an advisor to a venture capital firm, A16Z. So through them, I do interact with startups from time to time. And that's been very, and that's very helpful for, because right now, I mean, it's such a blank slate on the research side, like what research question to even ask, right? And so that's a pretty helpful calibrating force, right? So ultimately, I want to do good science. That's the goal. But if I have a choice between doing like a cool math paper that's relevant and a cool math paper that's not relevant, I would prefer to do the one that's relevant. And so talking to people who are really building these things, I mean, it's just, the question, I mean, it's really interesting. So it's just like, if 6 people in a row ask me the same question, I'm like, okay, this is probably a good research problem. You know what I mean? So that's what's so cool. I mean, like I said, there's this palpable hunger for more knowledge and for, just kind of, well-founded guidance, about all of these different design problems. And so it really feels like a unique moment in time. as a computer scientist and as a sort of algorithmic game theorist and as a mechanism designer, where it just feels like a point in time where, in addition to writing really cool papers, you can actually really help people, build the things that they want to build. So that confluence is rare enough. You really have to jump at the opportunity when it comes along. So that's why I've sort of dropped everything and I'm spending almost all my time on this now.
So Professor Roughgarden, last question. I know we have 2 minutes left. Since the name of our show is Policy Punchline, what would your punchline be for this interview? And I know this is also another question that's on Seon's mind. Are we going to expect a cryptocurrency textbook coming soon? Since you are such a prolific textbook writer, a great educator and teacher, so are we going to expect anything pedagogical from you?
Right. I mean, so yes, I don't know the form. Like I said, this course in the fall, it's over the last decade, I've come up with a good workflow for producing educational materials. And so that's been really, because I still am a full-time researcher. So there's no way I could sort of write these books without having a really good process, to do it efficiently. And so, basically what I do is I sort of teach a course, I teach it a few times so that I finally understand it. I do very detailed lecture notes. I write the lecture notes immediately after I give the lecture, so I can write them actually extremely quickly. Some courses, I just leave the lecture notes up for posterity and then I forget about it. Other ones, if I feel like there's enduring interest, I sort of then edit those into a book. So like my 20 lectures on algorithmic game theory book, for example, was written in this way. So I'm definitely hoping to generate, both lecture notes and a set of videos from this course and then maybe future iterations of that course. Whether it becomes a book, I mean, honestly, the space is moving so fast right now. It's not actually clear to me that makes a lot of sense. But so right now, my approach is just like, let's figure out a way to generate a lot of raw material. And then as the years go by, it may become clearer what's sort of the most helpful way to sort of package that material for people to consume. At the moment, I just kind of feel like it feels like it's a really personal learning journey. And I just want to allow others to sort of tag along with me if they want. That's kind of going to be the purpose of the lecture notes and the videos and this kind of stuff. It's very much not, someone who's figured everything out, like laying down the wisdom. It's not like a sage who sort of, is going to tell everyone how everything works. It's honestly more, I'm just trying to understand everything. And the stuff that I figure out, I just want to tell people about. Like I said, first step, teach yourself. Second step, figure out how to communicate that clearly to other people. So that aspect of my sort of life and career is not going away anytime soon. So
you're too humble, Professor Roughgarden. Thank you so much for teaching Seon and me so much. Even though we haven't asked you which coin to buy to become the next millionaire. I mean, we didn't ask for investment advice today, but thank you so much for teaching us so much for this wonderful conversation. It's such a great honor to meet you. So
thanks so much, Professor Roughgarden.
Thanks so much, guys. A lot of fun. So.
And hopefully we can get together in person soon. I'm moving to New York this weekend to start work. Our friend is going to Columbia, and maybe we can get together in Columbia soon. So it'll be great to
sounds great.
pay you a visit. So
okay,
yeah,
excellent.
We'll keep you posted, but we won't keep you much longer. Yeah, but thanks so much for joining us today.
All right, thanks a lot, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.